Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where we uncover stories that shaped our world. Tonight we're journeying to India, a subcontinent so geographically diverse it contains everything from glacial peaks to tropical beaches, and so historically rich it practically invented the concept of ancient civilizations having trust issues with invaders. From the fertile plains, where rivers have been arguing over borders longer than modern diplomats, to the monsoon rains that arrive more punctually than most people arrive at work, India's landscapes have nurtured humanity's greatest experiments in philosophy, mathematics, and the fine art of making tea properly. We'll explore 5,000 years of empires, innovations, and the occasional empire that thought it would last forever. Spoiler alert, none of them did. This is a story of resilience, diversity, and a democracy that somehow holds together, despite containing more languages than a particularly ambitious polyglot's nightmare. If these calm explorations help you unwind, consider smashing that subscribe button. It genuinely helps us continue these deep dives into our planet's most fascinating places. So settle back, let your mind wander, and join us as we discover the remarkable story of India. Chapter 1: Ancient Foundations and Geography, Indus Valley to Mauryan Empire. Picture, if you will, the Indian subcontinent as nature's own masterpiece, a massive triangle of land jutting into the Indian Ocean like a determined thumb pointing toward adventure. This isn't just any piece of real estate. This is a geological celebrity that broke away from the supercontinent Gondwana around 120 million years ago and decided to take a rather dramatic road trip northward. The result? When India crashed into Asia about 50 million years ago, it created what we now call the Himalayas. Talk about making an entrance. Most of us are happy if we can parallel park without scraping a bumper, but India literally moved mountains. The geography of this remarkable land reads like a textbook that somehow became a work of art. In the north, the Himalayas stretch across the horizon like nature's own Great Wall, complete with peaks so high they seem to have delusions of grandeur. Mount Kanchenjunga, India's highest peak, reaches 28,169 feet, which is roughly the altitude where most people start questioning their life choices. These mountains aren't just pretty faces, they're the reason India has seasons that make sense, acting like a massive barrier that keeps the cold Siberian winds at bay, while trapping the monsoon moisture that turns the subcontinent into a green paradise each summer. Below this mountain fortress lies the Indo-Gangetic Plain, a stretch of land so fertile that ancient peoples probably looked at it and thought they'd found the world's largest garden bed. This plain, carved by the sacred Ganges River and its companions, became the stage upon which much of Indian civilization would perform its greatest acts. The Ganges itself flows over 1,500 miles from the Himalayas to the Bay of Bengal, and along the way, it has witnessed more history than a particularly gossipy librarian. If rivers could write memoirs, the Ganges would need a multi-volume set. To the south lies the Deccan Plateau, a raised table of ancient rock that gives the impression that the earth decided it needed a really impressive coffee table. This plateau, with its black cotton soil and mineral wealth, would later become home to powerful kingdoms that proved the south was every bit as politically sophisticated as the north, and probably threw better parties, judging by the elaborate temples they left behind. The coastlines tell their own stories of maritime adventure and trade. The western coast, facing the Arabian Sea, became India's window to the Middle East and Europe, while the eastern coast looked towards Southeast Asia like a friendly neighbour peeking over the fence. Between these coasts lie over 1 million square miles of diverse landscapes, from the sandy expanses of the Thar Desert in Rajasthan, where camels have been perfecting their "I'm too cool for this heat" expression for millennia, to the lush backwaters of Kerala, where coconut palms sway like they're permanently set to a relaxing jazz soundtrack. But long before anyone was drawing political boundaries or arguing about whose turn it is to control the remote, this land was already buzzing with human activity. Around 3,300 years before the Common Era, when most of the world was still figuring out that bronze was superior to stone for making tools, a remarkable civilization flourished in the Indus Valley. This wasn't some small village experiment in communal living. We're talking about a civilization that covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization after one of its major sites, was essentially the overachiever of the ancient world. These people built cities that would make modern urban planners weep with envy. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, their two greatest cities, featured grid-patterned streets that were apparently laid out by someone with a serious appreciation for right angles and urban efficiency. Their drainage systems were so advanced that they included covered sewers and public baths, amenities that some parts of the world wouldn't see again for thousands of years. What's particularly endearing about the Harappan people is their apparent obsession with standardization. They created uniform weights, measures, and even brick sizes across their entire civilization. Imagine travelling 1,500 miles in the ancient world and finding that the bricks in one city are exactly the same size as those in another. These people clearly understood the value of consistency, probably the kind of individuals who would organize their spice racks alphabetically and actually maintain the system. The Harappans were also master craftspeople, creating intricate seals with mysterious scripts that scholars are still trying to decipher. These seals often featured animals like bulls, elephants, and what appears to be a unicorn, though sadly, archaeological evidence suggests this was probably just artistic license, rather than proof that magical horned horses once roamed the subcontinent. The civilization engaged in extensive trade, with Harappan artifacts found as far away as Mesopotamia, proving that even 4,000 years ago, people understood the benefits of a good import-export business. But like all great civilizations, the Harappan culture eventually faced decline. Around 1,800 years before the Common Era, their cities began to be abandoned. The reasons remain debated: climate change, river course changes, invasion, or perhaps they all just decided simultaneously that city life was overrated and went off to try subsistence farming. Whatever the cause, their disappearance left a gap in the historical record that wouldn't be filled until new peoples arrived on the scene. Enter the Indo-Aryans, who began migrating into the Indian subcontinent around 1,500 years before the Common Era. These weren't invaders in the dramatic Hollywood sense, more like a gradual movement of pastoral peoples who brought with them horses, a love of cattle that bordered on the obsessive, and an oral tradition that would eventually become some of the world's oldest religious literature. The term Aryan, by the way, simply meant noble in their language, and had nothing to do with the completely unrelated racial theories that would unfortunately emerge thousands of years later. The Indo-Aryans settled primarily in the northwestern regions and gradually spread across the Gangetic Plain, bringing with them the Sanskrit language and the early foundations of what would become Hinduism. Their earliest compositions, the Vedas, were memorized and passed down orally with such precision that they remained virtually unchanged for over a millennium before being written down. This was basically the ancient world's equivalent of a telephone game that actually worked. Imagine passing along the same songs and stories for 50 generations without anyone adding their own creative interpretations or forgetting the good bits. These early Vedic texts give us glimpses into a society that was transitioning from nomadic pastoralism to settled agriculture. They describe a world where cattle were currency. Soma was the drink of choice, though archaeologists are still debating what exactly soma was, possibly a hallucinogenic plant, which would explain some of the more creative passages in ancient literature. and fire sacrifices were the preferred method of divine communication. The society was organized into tribes led by chiefs called rajas, who were probably the ancient equivalent of the popular kid in school who somehow gets elected class president. As the Indo-Aryans settled and intermingled with existing populations, their society became increasingly complex. The Varna system emerged, originally a simple division between the priests, Brahmins, warriors, kshatriyas, merchants, vaishyas, and labourers Hudras. What started as perhaps a practical social organization would later evolve into the more rigid caste system, proving that humans have an impressive talent for taking simple ideas and turning them into complicated social institutions that future generations spend centuries trying to reform. By 800 years before the Common Era, the Indo-Aryans had established numerous small kingdoms across northern India. This was the period of the Mahajanapadas, literally great territories, which sounds much more impressive than calling them medium-sized kingdoms run by people who really wanted to be pharaohs but were born in the wrong part of the world. 16 major kingdoms emerged, each with their own capital, army, and presumption that they were obviously destined to rule all the others. Among these kingdoms, Magadha gradually emerged as the powerhouse, thanks to its strategic location in the fertile Gangetic plain, its access to iron ore, and what appears to have been a series of particularly ambitious rulers who weren't content with managing their own territory but felt compelled to manage everyone else's as well. The kingdom's capital, Rajagriha, became a centre of power that would eventually give rise to India's first true empire. This was also the period that gave birth to two of the world's major religions. Around the 6th century before the Common Era, two remarkable individuals emerged who would fundamentally change human philosophical thought. Siddhartha Gautama, who became known as the Buddha, was a prince who decided that palace life was too comfortable and went off to find enlightenment under a tree, thereby inspiring countless future generations to question whether they too should quit their day jobs and seek spiritual awakening, though most would ultimately decide that regular meals were probably worth keeping. Meanwhile, Vardhamana Mahavira established the principles of Jainism, a religion so dedicated to non-violence that its followers swept the ground before walking to avoid stepping on insects. Jainism's commitment to ahimsa, or non-violence, was so thorough that it makes modern veganism look like a casual dietary preference. Both Buddhism and Jainism challenged the existing religious order, offering alternatives to Vedic rituals and priestly authority, sort of like the ancient world's version of religious reformation, but with more meditation and fewer angry pamphlets. The political landscape continued to evolve, with larger kingdoms absorbing smaller ones in a process that was basically the ancient equivalent of corporate mergers, except with more elephants and fewer PowerPoint presentations. By the 4th century before the Common Era, the stage was set for the emergence of something unprecedented in Indian history, a unified empire that would stretch across most of the subcontinent. This brings us to one of history's most fascinating figures, Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the Mauryan Empire. Chandragupta was apparently the kind of person who looked at the fragmented political landscape of India and thought, "You know what this needs? One person in charge of everything." With the help of his advisor Chanakya, a political theorist so cunning that Machiavelli would have taken notes, Chandragupta managed to overthrow the powerful Nanda dynasty and establish an empire that would become the largest in ancient Indian history. The Mauryan Empire, established around 321 before the Common Era, was India's first taste of large-scale political unity. Chandragupta's empire stretched from Afghanistan to Bengal, encompassing most of the Indian subcontinent except for the southern tip. This wasn't just conquest for the sake of conquest. The Mauryans created a sophisticated administrative system that managed to govern this vast territory with remarkable efficiency. They established a centralized bureaucracy, maintained a large standing army, and created a network of spies that would have made modern intelligence agencies proud. The capital, Pataliputra, modern-day Patna, became one of the largest cities in the ancient world, with a population that may have reached 500,000 people. Greek ambassadors who visited described it as a magnificent city with elaborate palaces and broad avenues, basically the ancient world's equivalent of a metropolitan showcase, complete with all the urban amenities a power-hungry emperor could desire. Chandragupta's empire was further consolidated by his son Bindusara, who continued the family business of territorial expansion with the dedication of someone building a particularly ambitious model train set. But it was Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, who would transform the empire from a mere political entity into something approaching a moral force. And that, dear listeners, is where our next section of this journey through Indian history will take us, to an emperor who discovered that conquering the world was less satisfying than trying to save it. For now, as we pause in our exploration of this remarkable subcontinent, let your mind rest on the image of ancient India, a land where rivers carved civilizations from the wilderness, where philosophers questioned everything under Bodhi trees, and where empires rose from the dreams of ambitious young men who refused to accept that the world was too large to govern. The foundations were laid, the stage was set, and the greatest stories were yet to come. Chapter 2: Classical Periods and Regional Powers, Ashoka to Medieval Kingdoms. As we continue our gentle journey through India's vast historical landscape, we find ourselves at one of history's most remarkable turning points, the transformation of a conqueror into a messenger of peace. Emperor Ashoka, whom we glimpsed at the end of our last exploration, was about to experience an epiphany that would not only change his life but echo through the corridors of time for over 2 millennia. Ashoka ascended to the throne around 268 years before the Common Era, following what appears to have been a rather dramatic family succession dispute. Ancient texts suggest he had to contend with his brothers for the crown, a situation that probably made family dinners rather awkward for several years. Once firmly established as emperor, Ashoka initially followed the family business model of territorial expansion, demonstrating the kind of military enthusiasm that had made his grandfather Chandragupta famous. 8 years into his reign, around 261 before the Common Era, Ashoka set his sights on Kalinga, a prosperous coastal kingdom in what is now Odisha. Kalinga was essentially the last major holdout against Mauryan dominance, controlling important trade routes and boasting a strategic position along the Bay of Bengal. It was also home to people who were apparently quite content with their independence and had no particular desire to join the Mauryan Empire, a sentiment that would prove to be rather costly to maintain. The Kalinga War that followed was, by ancient standards, catastrophically brutal. Ashoka's own inscriptions record that over 100,000 soldiers died in battle, with another 150,000 people deported from their homes. These numbers, coming from Ashoka himself, represent a level of destruction that would make even modern military commanders pause for reflection. The countryside was left littered with bodies, villages were burned, and families were torn apart, all for the sake of adding another territory to an already vast empire. But here's where our story takes an extraordinary turn. Legend tells us that after the battle, Ashoka walked through the battlefield to survey his victory. Instead of the usual triumphant tour enjoyed by conquering kings, Ashoka found himself confronted with scenes of such devastation that they fundamentally altered his worldview. The sight of corpses scattered across the landscape, the wails of the bereaved, and the smoke rising from destroyed homes apparently had the effect of the world's most effective therapy session on the emperor. Ashoka's own words, carved in stone for posterity, capture his remorse with startling honesty. The conquest of a previously unconquered country involves the slaughter, death, and carrying away captive of the people. That is a matter of profound sorrow and regret to his sacred majesty. This wasn't the usual royal propaganda about glorious victory. This was a public confession of regret from one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, essentially admitting that he had made a terrible mistake. This moment of realization led Ashoka to embrace Buddhism and renounce the path of military conquest in favor of what he called Dharma Vijaya, victory through righteousness. It was probably the most expensive spiritual awakening in human history, considering it cost him an entire war and an empire's worth of military momentum. But the transformation was genuine and profound. The man who had once been described as maintaining a legendary torture chamber became a patron of non-violence, compassion, and moral governance. Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism wasn't merely personal. It became the cornerstone of his imperial policy. He established a vast network of stone pillars and rock inscriptions across his empire, creating what was essentially the ancient world's most extensive public information campaign. These edicts, carved in local languages and scripts, promoted moral principles, religious tolerance, and social welfare. The famous lion capital of Ashoka, with its 4 lions standing back to back, became so iconic that it serves as India's national emblem today, proving that good branding can last over 2,000 years. The emperor's commitment to his new philosophy extended to practical governance. He appointed officials called Dharma ministers to travel throughout the empire, promoting moral conduct, established hospitals for both humans and animals, planted medicinal herbs, and built roads with rest houses for travelers. He even took the relatively progressive step of extending these welfare policies to animals, prohibiting the killing of certain species, and establishing what were essentially the world's first animal protection laws. Ashoka was basically running a 23rd century BCE version of a modern welfare state, complete with public health care and environmental protection. Under Ashoka's rule, the Mauryan Empire experienced nearly 4 decades of peace and prosperity. Buddhism spread throughout India and beyond, with Ashoka sending missionaries to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and even as far as Greece and Egypt. His own children reportedly became Buddhist missionaries, which suggests that his conversion wasn't just political theatre but a genuine family commitment to their new faith. The empire became a beacon of religious tolerance, with Ashoka explicitly protecting the rights of all religious communities while promoting Buddhist principles of non-violence and compassion. However, even the most enlightened empires are subject to the laws of historical gravity. After Ashoka's death around 232 before the Common Era, the Mauryan Empire began to experience the kind of decline that seems almost inevitable for large ancient states. His successors lacked both his political acumen and his moral authority, and the empire gradually fragmented under the pressures of regional autonomy, economic strain, and external threats. The last Mauryan ruler, Brihadratha, was assassinated by his own army commander in 187 before the Common Era, bringing to an end what had been India's first great imperial experiment. The assassination of Brihadratha was carried out by Pushyamitra Shunga, who established the Shunga dynasty and marked the beginning of what historians call the post-Mauryan period. This era, spanning roughly from 200 before the Common Era to 300 of the Common Era, saw India fragment into numerous regional kingdoms, each carving out its own sphere of influence like ambitious players in an ancient game of Risk. While this fragmentation might seem like political chaos, it actually led to a remarkable flowering of regional cultures and the emergence of powerful new dynasties. The Shunga dynasty, established by the regicidal Pushyamitra, controlled much of northern India for over a century. These rulers were staunch supporters of Brahmanism and seemed determined to roll back some of Ashoka's Buddhist policies, perhaps the ancient equivalent of a political party winning an election and immediately reversing all the previous administration's initiatives. They patronized Vedic sacrifices, supported Brahmanical institutions, and oversaw the construction of some magnificent architectural projects, including expansions to the famous Sanchi Stupa, proving that even religiously conservative rulers could appreciate good craftsmanship when they saw it. Meanwhile, in the Deccan region of southern India, the Satavahana dynasty emerged as the dominant power. The Satavahanas were remarkable rulers who managed to create a kingdom that lasted for nearly 4 centuries, controlling the crucial trade routes between northern and southern India. Their capital at Pratishtana, modern Pathan, became a major commercial hub, and their kingdom served as a cultural bridge between the Sanskrit-speaking north and the Dravidian-speaking south. The Satavahanas were like the ancient world's ultimate middle managers, successfully balancing various cultural and political pressures while maintaining their own distinct identity. What made the post-Mauryan period particularly fascinating was the arrival of foreign dynasties from Central Asia. The collapse of Mauryan power had created something of a power vacuum in northwestern India, and various Central Asian peoples were more than happy to fill it. The Indo-Greeks, descendants of Alexander's generals who had established kingdoms in Bactria, crossed the Hindu Kush mountains and established kingdoms in areas that are now Afghanistan and Pakistan. These rulers created some of the most beautiful coins in ancient history, blending Greek artistic styles with Indian motifs and creating a cultural fusion that would have made modern multiculturalists proud. Following the Indo-Greeks came waves of other Central Asian peoples, the Shakas, also known as Scythians, the Parthians, and eventually the Kushans. Each group brought their own cultural traditions while simultaneously adopting Indian customs and beliefs. It was like a series of cultural exchange programs, except with more horses and considerably more territorial conquest. The Kushans, in particular, established an empire that stretched from Central Asia to the heart of the Indo-Gangetic plain, creating one of the ancient world's great cosmopolitan civilizations. The Kushan Empire reached its zenith under Emperor Kanishka in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. Kanishka was a patron of Buddhism and is credited with convening the 4th Buddhist Council, which helped spread Mahayana Buddhism throughout Central Asia and into China. His empire controlled crucial sections of the Silk Road, making the Kushans fabulously wealthy from trade between Rome, India, and China. Kushan coins have been found from London to Beijing, suggesting a commercial network that would impress even modern multinational corporations. But perhaps the most significant development of this period was the rise of the Gupta Empire in the 4th century of the Common Era. The Guptas emerged from relative obscurity to create what many historians consider the golden age of Indian civilization. Founded by Chandragupta, the first no relation to the earlier Mauryan Chandragupta, the Gupta Empire represented a renaissance of Indian culture that would influence the subcontinent for centuries to come. Chandragupta I established the foundations of Gupta power around 320 of the Common Era through a combination of military skill and strategic marriage alliances. His union with Kumaradevi, a Lichavi princess, not only expanded his territory but also gave him access to important iron ore deposits. Iron, in the 4th century, was roughly equivalent to what oil is today, a strategic resource that could make or break kingdoms. With superior metallurgy providing his armies with better weapons, Chandragupta was able to expand his kingdom throughout much of the Gangetic plain. The real architect of Gupta greatness, however, was Chandragupta's son Samudragupta, who ruled from approximately 335 to 375 of the Common Era. Samudragupta was the kind of ruler who probably looked at maps and saw them as personal to-do lists. His military campaigns, recorded in magnificent detail on the Allahabad pillar inscription, describe how he conquered or subjugated dozens of kings across the Indian subcontinent. The inscription, composed by his court poet Harappan, credits him with being the conqueror of the four corners of the earth, which was either poetic license or evidence that ancient Indians had a rather creative understanding of geography. What made Samudragupta remarkable wasn't just his military prowess but his cultural sophistication. He was a patron of the arts and is depicted on coins playing the veena, a stringed instrument that was apparently the ancient equivalent of the guitar for sensitive, artistic types. His court attracted scholars, poets, and artists from across India, creating a cultural flowering that set the stage for even greater achievements under his successors. Samudragupta essentially proved that you could be both a successful conqueror and a Renaissance patron, the ultimate ancient overachiever. The Gupta Empire reached its absolute peak under Chandragupta II, also known as Vikramaditya, who ruled from approximately 375 to 415 of the Common Era. Chandragupta II was the kind of ruler who managed to make imperial administration look elegant. He defeated the powerful Western Kshatrapas, gaining control of Gujarat's profitable ports and expanding Gupta influence to the Arabian Sea. His court in Ujjain became legendary for its cultural achievements, attracting the famous 9 gems or Navaratna, 9 brilliant scholars who collectively represent one of the greatest intellectual assemblages in human history. Among these 9 gems was Kalidasa, often considered the greatest Sanskrit poet and dramatist, whose works like Shakuntala continue to be performed today. Another was Aryabhata, the mathematician and astronomer who calculated the length of the solar year to within 3 hours of the modern figure and proposed that the Earth rotated on its axis, revolutionary ideas that wouldn't be widely accepted in Europe for another 1,000 years. It's as if Chandragupta II had somehow managed to gather the ancient equivalent of Nobel Prize winners at his court and convince them all to work on creative projects together. The Gupta period saw remarkable advances in science, mathematics, literature, and art. Indian numerals, later known as Arabic numerals in the West, were developed during this time, along with the concept of zero as both a number and a placeholder, mathematical innovations that would eventually revolutionize commerce and science worldwide. The Ajanta and Ellora caves, with their magnificent sculptures and paintings, represent some of the finest artistic achievements in human history, demonstrating a level of skill that continues to amaze modern visitors. Gupta administration was notable for its relative decentralization and tolerance. Unlike the highly centralized Mauryan system, the Guptas allowed local rulers considerable autonomy in exchange for tribute and loyalty. This approach created a stable and prosperous empire where trade flourished, cities grew, and cultural exchange thrived. The Chinese pilgrim Fa Hien, who visited India during Chandragupta II's reign, wrote glowing accounts of the empire's prosperity, just taxation, and general contentment of the population. Getting positive reviews from foreign visitors is always a good sign for any government. However, even golden ages must eventually tarnish. The Gupta Empire began to decline in the late 5th century of the Common Era, primarily due to invasions by the Huns, a nomadic confederation from Central Asia. These weren't the same Huns who terrorized Europe under Attila, but a related group who proved equally effective at destabilizing established civilizations. The Hun invasions, combined with internal succession disputes and the gradual assertion of independence by regional rulers, led to the fragmentation of the Gupta Empire by the mid-6th century. The end of Gupta rule marked the beginning of what historians call the early medieval period in Indian history, characterized by the emergence of numerous regional kingdoms and the development of what would become classical Indian feudalism. Powers like the Pushyabhuti dynasty of Harsha in the north, various Rajput clans in western India, and the Chalukyas in the Deccan carved out their own kingdoms from the ruins of Gupta authority. Each developed distinctive cultural and political traditions, while maintaining connections to the broader Indian civilization that had been nurtured during the classical period. As our journey through this classical period concludes, we find ourselves at the threshold of medieval India, where new powers and new challenges await. The foundations laid during the Mauryan period, refined during the Gupta Golden Age, and diversified during the regional kingdoms era, had created a civilization of remarkable sophistication and resilience. India had survived the collapse of empires, absorbed waves of foreign invaders, and continuously renewed itself through cultural synthesis and adaptation. Chapter 3: Islamic Conquests and the Mughal Era. As we turn the page on our exploration of classical India, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of one of history's most transformative periods. The medieval era would bring new peoples, new faiths, and new forms of governance to the Indian subcontinent, forever altering the cultural and political landscape that had evolved over millennia. Our story now moves into an age of conquest and synthesis, where Islamic traditions would meet Indian civilization to create something entirely unique. The first significant Islamic incursion into India came not from the northwest passes that had welcomed so many previous invaders, but from the sea. In 711 of the Common Era, a young Arab commander named Muhammad ibn al-Qasim led an expedition across the Arabian Sea to the coast of Sind. He was barely 17 years old, an age when most people today are worried about college entrance exams rather than conducting military campaigns across continents. But Muhammad ibn al-Qasim was operating under the orders of al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the powerful governor of Iraq, and carried with him both the military might of the Umayyad Caliphate and the religious zeal of early Islam. The immediate pretext for this invasion was relatively minor, a dispute over pirates who had attacked Arab merchant ships near the Sindhi coast. But the real motivation was the irresistible lure of India's legendary wealth and the Islamic imperative to spread the faith to new lands. Muhammad ibn al-Qasim's campaign culminated in his defeat and execution of Raja Dahir, the ruler of Sind, in 712. The young commander then established Arab rule over much of present-day Pakistan, creating the first lasting Muslim presence in the Indian subcontinent. What made this early Islamic conquest particularly significant was the administrative policies that followed. Muhammad ibn al-Qasim established a relatively tolerant system where Hindus and Buddhists were granted dhimmi status, protected peoples who could continue practicing their faiths in exchange for paying the jizya tax. It was essentially the ancient world's version of devolved government. This Arab expansion might have continued further had it not been for determined resistance from various Indian kingdoms. The Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, and Gurjara Pratiharas successfully contained Islamic expansion for nearly 3 centuries. The next major wave of Islamic conquest came from a different direction and with very different motivations. Mahmud of Ghazni, who ruled from 998 to 1030 of the Common Era, launched what can only be described as the ancient world's most persistent get-rich-quick scheme. Between 1000 and 1027, Mahmud conducted 17 separate raids into northern India, each designed primarily to plunder wealth rather than establish permanent rule. He was essentially running a highly successful medieval equivalent of a smash-and-grab operation, except with armies instead of getaway cars. Mahmud's most famous exploit was his raid on the Somnath temple in Gujarat in 1025. This temple was not only one of the holiest sites in Hinduism, but also one of the wealthiest, having accumulated centuries' worth of devotional offerings. Mahmud's forces looted an enormous treasure and destroyed the temple's sacred lingam, shocking the Hindu world and demonstrating the vulnerability of even the most revered religious sites. The psychological impact was profound. It was as if someone had successfully robbed Fort Knox while simultaneously desecrating St. Peter's Basilica. What's particularly striking about Mahmud's campaigns is how they reveal both the wealth and the political fragmentation of 11th century India. The fact that he could return repeatedly for over 2 decades suggests not only that India was rich enough to make these expeditions profitable, but also that the Indian kingdoms were too divided to mount an effective coordinated resistance. The pattern of Islamic conquest changed dramatically with the arrival of Muhammad Ghori in the late 12th century. Unlike his predecessors, who were primarily interested in wealth extraction, Muhammad Ghori sought to establish permanent Muslim rule in northern India. His campaigns culminated in the decisive Second Battle of Tarain in 1192, where he defeated Prithviraj Chauhan, the powerful Rajput ruler of Delhi and Ajmer. This victory opened the heartland of India to Islamic conquest and marked the end of Hindu political dominance in the north for the next several centuries. When Muhammad Ghori was assassinated in 1206, his empire provided the foundation for what would become the Delhi Sultanate. His lieutenant Qutbuddin Aibak, a former slave who had risen to become one of Ghori's most trusted commanders, established the first Islamic dynasty to rule from Delhi. The Delhi Sultanate, which lasted from 1206 to 1526, represents one of history's most fascinating experiments in cross-cultural governance. 5 successive dynasties, the Mamluks, Khaljis, Tughlaqs, Sayyids, and Lodis, ruled over a predominantly Hindu population while maintaining Islamic law and customs. It was a delicate balancing act that required considerable political skill and, occasionally, impressive flexibility in interpreting religious doctrine. The Mamluk dynasty, also known as the Slave dynasty, established the basic framework of Islamic rule in India. These rulers created a distinctive Indo-Islamic administrative system that borrowed from both Islamic traditions and existing Indian practices. They built the magnificent Qutb Minar, which still stands in Delhi as testimony to their architectural ambitions. At over 200 feet tall, it was essentially the medieval world's skyscraper, designed to announce to everyone within miles that new management had taken over. The Khalji dynasty brought a new level of energy and ambition to the Sultanate. Alauddin Khalji, who ruled from 1296 to 1316, was perhaps the most capable of all the Delhi sultans. He successfully repelled multiple Mongol invasions while simultaneously expanding the Sultanate's control into the Deccan. His court became a center of Persian culture and learning, attracting scholars and artists from across the Islamic world. The famous poet Amir Khusro, who served in Alauddin's court, is credited with developing several musical instruments and poetic forms that remain central to Indian classical music and literature. The Tughlaq dynasty represented both the height and the beginning of the end of the Delhi Sultanate's power. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who ruled from 1325 to 1351, was one of history's most intellectually gifted but practically disastrous rulers. His experimental policies included shifting the capital from Delhi to Daulatabad in the Deccan, a logistical nightmare that involved moving an entire city's population 600 miles south and introducing token currency that was promptly counterfeited on a massive scale. These well-intentioned but poorly executed reforms earned him a reputation as a brilliant fool. The Sultanate's decline accelerated after Timur's devastating invasion of Delhi in 1398. Timur, the ruler of Samarkand, conducted what can only be described as a masterclass in medieval urban destruction, leaving Delhi in ruins and the Tughlaq dynasty permanently weakened. The subsequent Sayyid and Lodi dynasties struggled to maintain control over even their core territories. It was into this fragmented political landscape that Babur arrived in the early 16th century. Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad, who took the title Babur, meaning tiger, combined the blood of both Timur and Genghis Khan with the refined sensibilities of a poet and naturalist. His memoirs, the Baburnama, reveal a man who could write movingly about gardens while planning military campaigns across continents. Babur's victory over Ibrahim Lodi at the First Battle of Panipat in 1526 marked the beginning of Mughal rule in India. This wasn't just another change of dynasty. It represented the arrival of a new kind of imperial vision that would transform the Indian subcontinent. Babur brought with him advanced military technology, including artillery and matchlocks, along with sophisticated administrative practices developed in the Timurid courts of Central Asia. More importantly, he brought a conception of empire that emphasized cultural synthesis rather than religious orthodoxy. Babur's son Humayun inherited an empire that was still more of a promising start than an established fact. His reign was marked by constant warfare against Afghan competitors and a humiliating 15-year exile in Persia after being defeated by Sher Shah Suri. Humayun's eventual return and restoration in 1555 demonstrated considerable personal resilience, but his death the following year from a fall down his library steps provided a rather ironic end to a life spent climbing back from political disaster. It was Humayun's son Akbar who transformed the Mughal state from a military occupation into a true Indian empire. Ruling from 1556 to 1605, Akbar created an administrative and cultural synthesis that successfully integrated Islamic and Hindu traditions. His policy of sulh-i-kul, universal peace, promoted religious tolerance and cultural exchange, while his administrative reforms created an efficient revenue system that would endure for centuries. Akbar's court became a centre of learning and artistic achievement that attracted scholars, artists, and mystics from across Asia. His famous debates between representatives of different religions, Hindu, Islamic, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Jain, reflect a level of intellectual curiosity and religious tolerance that was remarkable for any era. He even attempted to create a new syncretic religion, Din-i-Ilahi, though this experiment attracted few followers beyond court flatterers who were probably just being polite to their emperor. The architectural achievements of Akbar's reign, particularly the creation of Fatehpur Sikri as a new capital, demonstrated the Mughal ability to blend Persian, Islamic, and Indian architectural traditions into something uniquely beautiful and functional. The city remains one of the world's best preserved examples of 16th century urban planning and architectural innovation. Under Akbar's successors, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire reached its greatest territorial extent and achieved its most magnificent cultural expressions. Jahangir continued his father's policies of tolerance while developing a personal passion for natural history and painting that made his court a centre of artistic innovation. Shah Jahan's architectural patronage produced the Taj Mahal, Red Fort, and Jama Masjid, monuments so magnificent that they continue to define global perceptions of Indian civilization 4 centuries later. The Taj Mahal, built as a mausoleum for Shah Jahan's beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, represents perhaps the pinnacle of Mughal architectural achievement. Its perfect proportions, exquisite craftsmanship, and innovative use of materials created a structure that seems to float like a dream materialized in marble. The building process employed thousands of craftsmen from across Asia and consumed enormous resources, but the result was a statement about the heights of beauty and devotion that human civilization could achieve. Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughal emperors, expanded the empire to its largest territorial extent, controlling virtually the entire Indian subcontinent from Kashmir to the Kaveri River. However, his reign also marked the beginning of the empire's decline. His more orthodox Islamic policies, including the reimposition of the jizya tax on non-Muslims and the destruction of some Hindu temples, alienated much of the Hindu population and created religious tensions that previous emperors had successfully managed to avoid. The Mughal Empire's administrative system was remarkably sophisticated, creating the first truly pan-Indian political structure since the Mauryas. The Mansabdari system of ranks and the Jagirdari system of land revenue created a professional nobility and efficient tax collection that generated enormous wealth. At its height during Aurangzeb's reign, the Mughal Empire controlled approximately 25% of global GDP, making it arguably the world's wealthiest political entity. The cultural achievements of the Mughal period extended far beyond architecture and administration. The development of Urdu as a literary language, the fusion of Persian and Indian musical traditions, the innovations in painting that combined Persian miniature techniques with Indian themes, and the creation of elaborate garden designs all testify to the creative energy unleashed by cultural synthesis. The Mughals proved that empire could be more than just political and military domination. It could be a catalyst for artistic and intellectual achievement. As we conclude our exploration of Islamic conquest and Mughal achievement, we find ourselves contemplating one of history's most successful examples of cross-cultural synthesis. The Mughal Empire succeeded because its founders and greatest rulers understood that lasting political control required cultural accommodation. They didn't simply impose foreign rule on India. They became Indian while remaining connected to wider Islamic and Persian traditions. But even the most magnificent empires face the inevitable pressures of time, geography, and human ambition. As we prepare to explore the next chapter of our journey through Indian history, we'll discover how European maritime powers would challenge Mughal supremacy and eventually establish their own forms of control over the subcontinent. The age of Islamic dominance was ending, but its cultural and political legacy would continue to influence Indian civilization long after the last Mughal emperor had lost his power. Chapter 4: Colonial Period and British Raj. As we transition from the magnificent courts of the Mughals to the counting houses of merchants, we find ourselves witnessing one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortune. The story of how a commercial enterprise originally established to trade in spices, textiles, and other exotic goods gradually transformed itself into the ruler of the world's most populous and diverse subcontinent, reads like a corporate takeover story written on an epic scale. This chapter of Indian history demonstrates how economic ambition, political opportunism, and technological advantage could fundamentally reshape entire civilizations. The East India Company arrived in India in 1612, when Captain William Hawkins obtained permission from Mughal Emperor Jahangir to establish a trading post in Surat. The company was essentially a group of London merchants seeking profitable trading opportunities, competing with Dutch, Portuguese, and French counterparts for access to Asia's luxury markets. The idea that these traders would eventually rule an empire stretching from the Hindu Kush to Burma would have seemed as absurd as suggesting that a modern software company might accidentally conquer Europe while expanding its market share. For over a century, the East India Company operated as designed. As a commercial entity focused on trade between India and Europe, the company established fortified trading posts at strategic coastal locations, including Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. These were essentially early modern corporate headquarters, complete with warehouses, offices, and minimal defensive capabilities. The transformation from merchant to ruler began gradually through the company's involvement in local politics. As the Mughal Empire weakened during the 18th century, various regional powers competed for control of territories and trade routes. The company found itself drawn into these conflicts, initially as an ally but increasingly as a direct participant. The decisive moment came with the Battle of Plassey on June 23, 1757, when Robert Clive led a company army against Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. This battle, which effectively lasted only a few hours and involved relatively small forces, nevertheless changed the course of world history. Clive's victory wasn't achieved primarily through military superiority but through a combination of strategic bribery, political manipulation, and betrayal that would have impressed Machiavelli. Key allies of the Nawab, including his own military commander Mir Jafar, had been secretly negotiating with the British and refused to fight when the moment came. The Battle of Plassey was essentially the 18th century's equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover, except instead of acquiring a company, the East India Company acquired control over Bengal, one of the world's wealthiest regions. The company didn't initially seek to directly administer Bengal. They preferred to rule through puppet nawabs while extracting maximum economic benefit with minimal administrative responsibility. It was a brilliant strategy that allowed them to enjoy the profits of empire while avoiding most of the costs and complications of actual governance. The victory was consolidated 7 years later at the Battle of Buxar in 1764, when company forces defeated a coalition, including the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II himself. Following this victory, the emperor granted the company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, essentially the right to collect land revenue from over 20 million people. This was arguably the most profitable contract in human history up to that point, providing the company with enormous wealth while maintaining the fiction that they were merely tax collectors rather than rulers. What followed was systematic wealth extraction from Bengal that contributed to devastating famines, including the Bengal famine of 1770, which killed approximately 10 million people. The company's response was to increase tax collection to compensate for reduced population, demonstrating economic callousness that shocked even 18th century observers. Meanwhile, the company expanded its territorial control through a combination of direct conquest and subsidiary alliances. The subsidiary alliance system, perfected by Governor-General Lord Wellesley, was a particularly elegant form of imperial control. Indian rulers who accepted subsidiary alliances retained their titles and internal autonomy, but had to maintain company troops at their own expense, accept British residents at their courts, and surrender control of foreign relations. It was essentially a protection racket, dressed up in diplomatic language. Rulers paid for the privilege of being protected from threats that often originated from the British themselves. The company's military expansion was facilitated by its innovative use of sepoys, Indian soldiers trained and equipped in European fashion but commanded by British officers. This system provided the company with large, relatively inexpensive armies that could be deployed across the subcontinent. The sepoys were generally well-trained and effective soldiers, but their position as Indians serving under British command in campaigns against other Indians created inherent tensions that would eventually explode into open rebellion. By the 1850s, the East India Company controlled directly or indirectly most of the Indian subcontinent. The company had become a unique entity in world history, a commercial corporation that ruled over more people than any European nation and commanded armies larger than most countries could field. The directors in London found themselves managing not just trade and profits but education policy, legal systems, religious conflicts, and the complex administration of history's most diverse empire. However, this extraordinary system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The company's rule had created widespread resentment among various sections of Indian society. Displaced rulers, exploited peasants, unemployed artisans, and increasingly discontented sepoys. The immediate spark for rebellion came from an almost comically inappropriate source: the introduction of new rifle cartridges greased with cow and pig fat, which offended both Hindu and Muslim religious sensibilities when soldiers had to bite them open to load their weapons. On May 10th, 1857, sepoys at Meerut mutinied after 85 of their comrades were imprisoned for refusing to use the offensive cartridges. The mutineers killed their British officers and marched to Delhi, where they proclaimed the restoration of the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II. What began as a military mutiny quickly spread into a broader rebellion that encompassed large areas of northern and central India. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, variously known as the Sepoy Mutiny, the Indian Mutiny, or the First War of Independence, depending on one's perspective, represented the first serious challenge to British rule in India. The rebellion involved not just sepoys but also dispossessed rulers, displaced landowners, and ordinary people who had grievances against company rule. Key figures included Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, who became a legendary symbol of resistance, and Nana Sahib, the adopted son of the last Maratha Peshwa. The rebellion was ultimately suppressed by 1858, but not without tremendous cost and brutality on both sides. British reprisals were particularly savage, including the notorious practice of tying sepoys to cannons before firing them, a punishment that demonstrated both the depth of British fear and anger and their complete misunderstanding of Indian culture and psychology. The rebellion fundamentally altered British attitudes toward India and Indians, replacing earlier paternalistic confidence with a more suspicious and rigid approach to colonial rule. The most immediate consequence of the rebellion was the end of East India Company rule. The Government of India Act of 1858 transferred all the company's territorial possessions and administrative functions to the British Crown. Queen Victoria's proclamation of November 1st, 1858, announced that India would henceforth be governed directly by the British government through a viceroy representing the Crown. The company, which had evolved from merchants to rulers, was finally put out of its misery and dissolved in 1874. The establishment of the British Raj marked the beginning of a new and more systematic phase of colonial rule. The Viceroy, based in Calcutta and later New Delhi, headed a professional colonial administration supported by the Indian Civil Service, an elite cadre of British officials who were among the most highly educated and well-paid bureaucrats in the world. This administrative system, often called the steel frame of British rule, proved remarkably effective at governing a territory of over 1.5 million square miles, containing nearly 300 million people of extraordinary diversity. The Raj was structured as a complex federal system that combined direct British administration with indirect rule through princely states. British India proper consisted of 11 major provinces, each headed by a governor, lieutenant governor, or chief commissioner responsible to the viceroy. Meanwhile, approximately 565 princely states retained nominal independence under British suzerainty, their rulers continuing to govern internal affairs while accepting British control over defence and foreign relations. This system of princely states was one of the more ingenious aspects of British imperial administration. The princes were allowed to maintain their courts, titles, and ceremonial functions, creating an elaborate theatre of traditional authority, while real power remained with the British. The princes served as useful buffer states and provided legitimacy for British rule by demonstrating that Indians could cooperate with the colonial system. Many princes became enthusiastic collaborators, modernising their states while remaining loyal to the crown. The British justified their rule through what they termed the civilising mission, the belief that British administration would modernise India and prepare Indians for eventual self-government. This ideology combined genuine reformist impulses with self-serving rationalisation in proportions that varied depending on the individual administrator and the specific circumstances. The British did indeed introduce significant reforms, including the abolition of sati, the construction of railways and telegraph lines, and the establishment of English language education, but these changes were implemented primarily to serve British interests rather than Indian welfare. The economic impact of British rule was profound and largely destructive to traditional Indian society. India was systematically transformed into a supplier of raw materials and a market for British manufactured goods, a process that destroyed much of the subcontinent's indigenous textile and handicraft industries. The famous economist Dadabhai Naoroji calculated that Britain annually drained wealth worth millions of pounds from India through unfavourable trade policies, administrative costs, and guaranteed returns on British investments, a process he termed the drain of wealth. The construction of railways, often cited as one of the benefits of British rule, primarily served imperial rather than Indian interests. The railway network was designed to facilitate the extraction of raw materials from interior regions to ports and the movement of troops to strategic locations, rather than to promote Indian economic development. While railways did eventually contribute to Indian economic integration and social change, their initial purpose was transparently colonial. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of British rule was the creation of a Western-educated Indian middle class. The British established universities in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras in 1857, and English education gradually spread throughout the country. This education created a class of Indians who were familiar with British political and legal concepts, including democracy, constitutional government, and individual rights, ideas that they would eventually turn against colonial rule itself. The irony of British educational policy was that it created the very people who would lead the independence movement. Indians educated in British institutions and British political thought began to question why principles of democracy and self-determination that applied in Britain should not apply in India. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, initially sought greater Indian participation in government rather than independence, but British reluctance to share real power gradually radicalized Indian political opinion. The period of high imperialism under viceroys like Lord Curzon demonstrated both the achievements and contradictions of the Raj. Curzon was an exceptionally capable administrator who reformed education and expanded the frontier. However, his partition of Bengal in 1905, ostensibly for administrative efficiency but actually to divide Hindu and Muslim communities, provoked the first mass nationalist movement. World War I marked another turning point. Over 1 million Indians served in the British war effort, demonstrating extraordinary loyalty. In return, Indians expected significant constitutional reforms after the war. Instead, the British responded with the Rowlatt Act of 1919, extending wartime restrictions on civil liberties. This betrayal, combined with the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar, fundamentally altered Indian nationalism and provided context for Gandhi's emergence as a mass leader. As we conclude our examination of the colonial period and the establishment of the British Raj, we find ourselves confronting one of history's most complex and controversial chapters. British rule in India represented both the pinnacle of European imperial achievement and a profound violation of principles of national self-determination and human dignity. The Raj created modern India's administrative and educational infrastructure, while simultaneously exploiting and impoverishing much of the population. It unified the subcontinent politically while dividing it communally and economically. The colonial period fundamentally transformed Indian society, creating new social classes, new forms of political organization, and new ideas about nation and citizenship that would shape the independence movement and modern India. But it also demonstrated the ultimate futility of governing people against their will, Regardless of the efficiency or ideological justification of the governing system, the British Raj, despite all its power and sophistication, contained within itself the forces that would eventually bring about its own destruction. Chapter 5: Independence Movement and Modern India. As the dust settled on the horrors of World War I and the reverberations from the Jallianwala Bagh massacre continued to echo across the subcontinent, India stood at a historical crossroads. The old certainties of colonial rule were crumbling, and a new generation of leaders was emerging with ideas that would fundamentally transform not just India, but the entire concept of resistance to imperial power. The story of how a frail lawyer with a spinning wheel managed to bring the world's largest empire to its knees represents one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of the power of organized, non-violent resistance. The architect of this extraordinary transformation was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who returned from South Africa in 1915 with a philosophy of satyagraha, literally holding fast to truth, that would revolutionize political protest. Gandhi's genius lay in understanding that empires depend on the consent of the governed. By systematically withdrawing that consent through non-violent non-cooperation, Gandhi demonstrated that even the most powerful empire could be rendered helpless. Gandhi's first major test of his methods came with the Champaran Satyagraha in 1917, when he supported indigo farmers in Bihar against exploitative plantation owners. This campaign, though small in scale, established Gandhi's credentials as someone who could successfully challenge British authority while maintaining strict non-violence. It was followed by the Keda Satyagraha in 1918, where Gandhi supported farmers facing crop failure and excessive taxation, again demonstrating the practical effectiveness of organized civil disobedience. However, it was Gandhi's response to the Rowlatt Act in 1919 that first brought him to national prominence. This legislation, which allowed indefinite detention without trial, sparked nationwide protests led by Gandhi. When British forces responded with the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh, killing hundreds of unarmed civilians, it created a watershed moment that radicalized Indian opinion and provided Gandhi with the moral authority to launch much larger movements against British rule. The non-cooperation movement of 1920 to 22 marked the beginning of mass political mobilization under Gandhi's leadership. The movement called for Indians to boycott British institutions, schools, courts, and products, while promoting indigenous alternatives. Millions of Indians participated, spinning their own cloth, withdrawing their children from government schools, and refusing to participate in the colonial legal system. The movement demonstrated the potential power of coordinated non-violent resistance on an unprecedented scale. Gandhi abruptly called off the movement in 1922 following the Chauri Chowra incident, where protesters killed 22 policemen. This decision demonstrated Gandhi's unwavering commitment to non-violence, even when it meant sacrificing immediate political gains. The 1920s saw relative political calm as Gandhi focused on social reform. However, by the decade's end, conditions were ripening for another major confrontation. At the Lahore session in December 1929, under Jawaharlal Nehru's presidency, the Congress adopted the goal of Purna Swaraj, complete independence. Gandhi's response was characteristically brilliant in its simplicity. The Salt March of 1930. On March 2nd, Gandhi wrote to Viceroy Lord Irwin, informing him of his intention to break the salt laws in 10 days unless specific demands were met. The choice of salt as the focus of civil disobedience was inspired. Salt was a basic necessity that affected every Indian, rich or poor, Hindu or Muslim. The British salt monopoly, which forced Indians to buy expensive, heavily taxed salt rather than collecting it themselves, symbolized the absurdity and injustice of colonial economic policy. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi set out from his Sabarmati ashram with 78 followers on a 240-mile march to the coastal village of Dandi. The 24-day march captured the world's imagination as thousands joined the procession along the route. At each stop, Gandhi addressed growing crowds, explaining the connection between the salt tax and India's broader subjugation. The march was both a brilliant piece of political theatre and a profound spiritual journey that transformed participants and observers alike. On April 6th, Gandhi reached the sea and ceremoniously picked up a handful of salt, technically breaking the law. This simple act sparked nationwide civil disobedience, as millions of Indians began making salt, boycotting British goods, and filling the prisons. The British authorities, initially uncertain how to respond to such massive non-violent resistance, eventually arrested over 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself in early May. The arrest of Gandhi only intensified the movement. On May 21st, the poet Sarojini Naidu led over 2,000 volunteers in a march on the Dharasana salt works. In full view of international journalists, British police systematically beat the non-violent protesters with steel-tipped clubs, creating some of the most powerful images of the independence struggle. These scenes, broadcast worldwide, exposed the brutality underlying British rule and generated enormous international sympathy for the Indian cause. The Salt Satyagraha continued until March 1931, when Gandhi signed the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, agreeing to suspend civil disobedience in exchange for the release of political prisoners and permission for Indians to make salt for domestic use. Although the immediate political gains were modest, the movement had achieved something far more significant. It had demonstrated that the British Empire could be effectively challenged through non-violent means and had created a model for mass resistance that would inspire liberation movements worldwide. World War II created new opportunities for the independence movement. Initially, Congress opposed India's involvement without consultation. The Cripps Mission of 1942, offering Dominion status after the war, was rejected as inadequate. Gandhi's response was the Quit India movement, demanding immediate British withdrawal. On August 8, 1942, the Congress passed Gandhi's resolution demanding immediate British withdrawal, with Gandhi delivering his famous call to do or die in the struggle for freedom. The British response was swift and severe. Within hours, Gandhi and virtually the entire Congress leadership were arrested and imprisoned. Without central coordination, the Quit India movement evolved into a largely spontaneous uprising that spread across the country. Students, workers, and peasants participated in widespread sabotage of government property, including railway lines, telegraph wires, and police stations. The movement demonstrated both the depth of anti-British sentiment and the potential for revolutionary action when constitutional politics failed. The British suppressed the movement ruthlessly, using aircraft to strafe and bomb protesters, deploying over 57 battalions of troops, and making over 100,000 arrests. Despite its suppression, the Quit India movement had a profound psychological impact, demonstrating that British rule in India was becoming increasingly untenable. The movement also marked the emergence of a younger, more radical generation of activists who were willing to contemplate more violent means of resistance. Parallel to Gandhi's non-violent movement, other forms of resistance were developing. Subhas Chandra Bose, who had broken with Gandhi over the question of violence, formed the Indian National Army with Japanese support, recruiting Indian prisoners of war to fight against British forces in Southeast Asia. Although the INA was ultimately unsuccessful militarily, the post-war trials of INA officers created enormous public sympathy and further undermined the legitimacy of British rule. By 1945, with World War II ending and a Labour government committed to decolonisation coming to power in Britain, Indian independence had become inevitable. The question was no longer whether India would become independent, but what form that independence would take. The growing demand from the Muslim League for a separate Pakistan, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had created a new and dangerous dynamic that would ultimately lead to the partition of the subcontinent. The period from 1946 to 1947 was marked by increasing communal violence as Hindu-Muslim tensions, long suppressed by British rule and Congress secularism, exploded into open conflict. The Great Calcutta Killings of August 1946, sparked by Jinnah's Direct Action Day, demonstrated how quickly communal harmony could collapse into horrific violence. These events convinced both British and Indian leaders that partition, however tragic, might be the only way to prevent civil war. Lord Mountbatten, appointed as the last Viceroy in February 1947, was given the task of transferring power by June 1948. However, the deteriorating situation convinced him to accelerate the timeline dramatically. On June 3, 1947, he announced that independence would come on August 15th, with the simultaneous creation of two dominions, India and Pakistan. The plan provided for the partition of Punjab and Bengal, provinces with mixed Hindu-Muslim populations based on district-level religious majorities. The partition was implemented with breathtaking speed and tragic inadequacy. Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a lawyer with no knowledge of India, was given 5 weeks to draw the borders that would separate India and Pakistan. The Radcliffe Line, as it became known, was not published until after independence, creating confusion and panic among populations who suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of the border. The human cost was catastrophic. Over 15 million people became refugees, and between 200,000 and 2 million died in the accompanying violence. On August 15, 1947, India achieved independence after nearly 2 centuries of British rule. In New Delhi, Jawaharlal Nehru delivered his famous Tryst with Destiny speech, declaring that India was awakening to life and freedom after its long slumber. The moment was both triumphant and tragic. Independence had been achieved, but at the cost of partition and unprecedented human suffering. Nehru, who became India's first Prime Minister, embodied the hopes and contradictions of the new nation. Educated at Harrow and Cambridge, he represented the Western-educated Indian elite that had led the independence struggle while remaining deeply committed to Indian nationalism and socialism. His vision for India combined democratic governance, secular values, scientific progress, and economic planning, an ambitious agenda for a newly independent nation, dealing with the trauma of partition and the challenges of integration. One of the most pressing challenges facing the new Indian government was the integration of over 500 princely states into the Union. Under the leadership of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, known as the Iron Man of India, this process was accomplished with remarkable success. Through a combination of persuasion, pressure, and in a few cases force, virtually all the princely states acceded to India by 1948. The major exceptions, Hyderabad, Junagadh, and Kashmir, required military intervention and created lasting problems. The Kashmir conflict emerged when Pakistani raiders invaded the state, prompting its Hindu ruler to accede to India. This led to the First Indo-Pakistani War of 1947-48, ending with a UN-mediated ceasefire that left Kashmir divided. Domestically, Nehru faced the challenge of nation-building in a diverse country. The Constitution, adopted on January 26, 1950, established India as a secular democratic republic. Economically, Nehru pursued mixed development with the first 5-year plan, focusing on agriculture and infrastructure. In foreign policy, Nehru charted a course of non-alignment, refusing to join either the American or Soviet blocs during the Cold War. Along with Egypt's Nasser and Yugoslavia's Tito, Nehru helped found the non-aligned movement, which sought to create a third path for developing nations. This policy reflected India's desire to maintain strategic autonomy while focusing on domestic development rather than international confrontation. However, Nehru's foreign policy faced its greatest test with the emergence of China as a regional power. Initially optimistic about Sino-Indian relations, Nehru promoted the Panchsheel, or Five Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, in 1954. However, border disputes in Aksai Chin and the Northeast Frontier Agency gradually poisoned relations. The Sino-Indian War of 1962 was a devastating defeat for India, exposing the inadequacy of its military preparedness and forcing a major reassessment of its foreign and defense policies. The early decades also saw significant social changes. The government promoted literacy, eliminated untouchability, and advanced women's rights through the Hindu Code Bills of the 1950s. Gandhi's assassination by a Hindu nationalist on January 30th, 1948, deprived India of its most revered leader. Nehru's response strengthened secular values and demonstrated the leadership crucial for India's survival as a democratic state. As we reach the end of this remarkable period, we find one of history's most extraordinary achievements, the transformation of a colonial territory into the world's largest democracy. The independence movement succeeded not just in ending British rule, but in creating new forms of political action that would inspire liberation movements worldwide. The India that emerged was a unified nation-state with democratic institutions, yet also a country scarred by partition and facing enormous challenges in building a modern economy while preserving cultural diversity. The legacy of the independence movement extends far beyond the achievement of political freedom. It demonstrated that imperial systems could be dismantled through non-violent means, that diverse populations could be united around shared aspirations for justice and dignity, and that traditional societies could modernize while preserving their cultural identities. As India embarked on its journey as an independent nation, it carried with it both the inspiration of this extraordinary achievement and the immense responsibility of proving that freedom, once won, could be used wisely for the benefit of all its people. Chapter 6: Contemporary India and Geographic Diversity. As we stand at the dawn of the 21st century's third decade, we find India transformed beyond the imagination of those who witnessed independence in 1947. The nation that emerged from the trauma of partition has evolved into a complex, dynamic, and increasingly influential global power, yet one that remains deeply rooted in the geographical foundations and cultural diversity that have defined the subcontinent for millennia. To understand contemporary India, we must first appreciate the remarkable geographic canvas upon which this extraordinary human drama continues to unfold. India's geography reads like a masterclass in planetary diversity. Stretching from 8 degrees to 37 degrees north latitude, the country encompasses virtually every climate and ecosystem found between the tropics and the temperate zones. The Tropic of Cancer bisects the nation, creating a natural division between the tropical south and the subtropical north, while the towering Himalayas in the north create their own vertical climate zones that range from subtropical valleys to Arctic peaks, crowned with permanent snow and ice. The Himalayas themselves represent one of Earth's most dramatic geological features, a mountain system stretching 2,400 kilometers across northern India, containing peaks that pierce the sky at altitudes exceeding 8,000 meters. Mount Kanchenjunga, at 8,598 meters, stands as India's highest peak, part of a mountain system that not only defines the country's northern boundary, but also serves as the source of the great river systems that have sustained Indian civilization for thousands of years. These mountains function as far more than scenic backdrops. They are India's primary water tower, containing the largest concentration of glaciers and permanent ice outside the polar regions. The Ganges, Yamuna, and Brahmaputra rivers all originate in these heights, creating the vast Indo-Gangetic plain that stretches across northern India. This plain represents one of the world's most fertile agricultural regions, supporting over 600 million people in what is essentially a giant alluvial delta deposited over millions of years by these Himalayan-fed rivers. Moving south from this northern plain, we encounter one of India's most distinctive geographic features, the Deccan Plateau. This ancient landmass, covering approximately 1.9 million square kilometers, represents the geological heart of peninsular India. Formed primarily by volcanic activity during the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago, the Deccan Traps consist of multiple layers of basaltic lava that have weathered into some of the world's most fertile black soils, particularly suitable for cotton cultivation. The plateau slopes gently from west to east, explaining why most of India's major peninsular rivers, the Godavari, Krishna, and Kaveri, flow eastward toward the Bay of Bengal. This eastward drainage pattern has profound implications for India's climate and agriculture, as these rivers carry the monsoon rains that fall on the western Ghats across the plateau and ultimately to the sea. The western and eastern Ghats, mountain ranges that parallel India's coasts, create some of the country's most dramatic climate contrasts. The western Ghats, rising abruptly from the coastal plain to heights of up to 8,000 feet, form a barrier that captures moisture from the southwest monsoon. This creates the paradox of India's wettest regions lying immediately adjacent to some of its driest, the lush rainforests of the western coastal strip, contrasting sharply with the rain-shadow regions of the interior Deccan. India's climate is fundamentally shaped by the monsoon system, a massive seasonal wind pattern that brings the majority of the country's rainfall between June and September. The southwest monsoon, drawing moisture from the Indian Ocean, provides the water that sustains nearly 70% of India's agricultural output. When these winds encounter the western Ghats, they deposit enormous amounts of rainfall, some stations recording over 11,000 millimeters annually, creating tropical rainforest conditions along the coast. However, once these moisture-laden winds cross the mountains, they create rain shadow effects that leave much of the interior plateau semi-arid. Cities like Pune and Hyderabad, located in these rain shadow regions, receive less than 1,000 millimeters of rainfall annually, creating landscapes that often resemble semi-desert during the dry season. This climatic diversity within relatively short distances creates the extraordinary variety of ecosystems for which India is famous. The diversity extends to India's coastal regions, where nearly 7,500 kilometers of coastline create distinct geographic and cultural zones. The western coast, with its narrow coastal plain backed by the steep western Ghats, supports dense populations engaged in fishing, trade, and increasingly, technology industries. The eastern coast, with its broader coastal plains and major river deltas, has traditionally been the center of rice cultivation and maritime trade with Southeast Asia. This geographic complexity provides the foundation for understanding contemporary India's most remarkable characteristic, its transformation into the world's most populous country. In the early 2020s, India surpassed China to become home to over 1.4 billion people, with projections suggesting the population will peak at around 1.7 billion in the early 2060s. This represents roughly 18% of all humanity concentrated in less than 2.5% of the world's land surface. What makes India's demographic story particularly fascinating is not just the absolute numbers, but the age structure of this vast population. Approximately 47% of Indians, some 650 million people, are under 25 years old, making India one of the world's youngest major countries. This creates what demographers call a demographic dividend, a period when a large portion of the population is of working age, potentially driving rapid economic growth if properly educated and employed. The challenge of harnessing this demographic potential is staggering in its complexity. India needs to create over 90 million new non-farm jobs by 2030 to employ 60 million new workers entering the job market, plus an additional 30 million jobs for those transitioning from agricultural to non-agricultural work. This requires sustained economic growth of over 8% annually, a target that pushes the boundaries of what any large economy has achieved over extended periods. Agriculture remains central to this challenge, employing nearly 60% of India's workforce, while contributing only about 16% of GDP, a disparity that highlights both the sector's inefficiency and its potential for improvement. The Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s transformed India from a food importer to a food exporter, but much of Indian agriculture still relies on traditional methods and remains vulnerable to monsoon variability and climate change. Modern technology is beginning to revolutionize this ancient sector. Precision agriculture, using satellite data, artificial intelligence, and Internet of Things sensors, allows farmers to optimize water usage, predict pest outbreaks, and improve yields while reducing environmental impact. Mobile technology has connected remote farmers to markets and weather information, while digital financial services have expanded access to credit for agricultural investment. The transformation is perhaps most visible in India's technology sector, which has evolved from a relatively modest beginning in the 1980s to become a global powerhouse. Cities like Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Pune have emerged as major technology hubs, housing the research and development centers of multinational corporations alongside a thriving startup ecosystem. India now produces over 4 million engineering graduates annually, creating a vast pool of technical talent that has made the country a destination for high-skill, high-value economic activities. This technological revolution has been accompanied by rapid urbanization. Currently, about 35% of Indians live in cities, but this proportion is growing rapidly. By 2035, projections suggest that 675 million Indians will be urban residents. Megacities like Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, and Hyderabad are expanding rapidly, creating both opportunities and challenges on an unprecedented scale. Urban growth brings enormous infrastructure challenges. Delhi, currently home to over 20 million people, may reach 28 million by 2041. Such growth requires massive investment in transportation, water supply, sewage treatment, and energy systems. India's Smart Cities mission represents an attempt to use technology to manage this urban growth more effectively, incorporating digital infrastructure alongside physical infrastructure development. The environmental challenges of sustaining such a large population in a geographically constrained space are becoming increasingly apparent. Air pollution in major cities regularly reaches hazardous levels, particularly during winter months when agricultural burning in surrounding regions combines with urban emissions and meteorological conditions to create toxic smog. Water scarcity affects hundreds of millions of people as groundwater levels decline and competition for river water intensifies. Climate change adds another layer of complexity to these challenges. India's position in the tropical and subtropical zones makes it particularly vulnerable to rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and extreme weather events. The Himalayan glaciers that feed India's major rivers are retreating, potentially affecting water security for hundreds of millions of people downstream. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities and agricultural areas, while increasing frequency of extreme weather events disrupts agriculture and urban infrastructure. Despite these challenges, India's economic transformation has been remarkable. From an economy worth $288 billion in 1992, India has grown to become the world's fifth largest economy by nominal GDP, valued at approximately $3.7 trillion. The services sector, led by information technology and business process outsourcing, now accounts for over 55% of GDP, while manufacturing and agriculture contribute roughly 25% and 15% respectively. This economic growth has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, though significant challenges remain. Income inequality has increased alongside overall growth, and regional disparities remain substantial. States like Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu have per capita incomes several times higher than those of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, creating internal migration pressures and political tensions. India's federal structure, with 28 states and 8 union territories, reflects the country's geographic and cultural diversity while creating governance challenges. States like Kerala have achieved near universal literacy and low infant mortality rates comparable to developed countries, while others still struggle with basic health and education indicators. This diversity within unity represents both India's greatest strength and its most persistent challenge. The cultural diversity that emerges from this geographic complexity is staggering. Over 700 languages are spoken across the country, with the Constitution recognizing 22 official languages. Hindi serves as the primary official language, but English remains the language of higher education, business, and technology, creating a unique linguistic landscape that bridges ancient traditions with global connectivity. Religious diversity adds another dimension to India's complexity. While roughly 80% of the population identifies as Hindu, India is also home to the world's second largest Muslim population, approximately 14% of the total. Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains form smaller but significant minorities, each contributing to the tapestry of Indian culture, while sometimes creating tensions that test the country's secular democratic framework. Food culture reflects this diversity magnificently, with cuisine varying dramatically across regions based on local geography, climate, and cultural traditions. The rice-based cuisines of the south and east contrast with the wheat-based foods of the north, while coastal regions feature seafood-heavy diets, and the arid regions of Rajasthan have developed preservation techniques suited to their harsh climate. Spices, many native to specific regions of India, create flavor profiles that vary from village to village. Traditional arts and crafts remain vibrant expressions of regional identity, from the intricate silk weaving of Varanasi to the block printing of Rajasthan, the metalwork of South India to the wood carving of Kashmir. These traditions increasingly find global markets through e-commerce platforms, connecting village artisans directly to international customers and providing sustainable livelihoods in rural areas. As we conclude our journey through the historical and geographical landscape of India, we find ourselves confronting a nation that embodies the full complexity of human civilization in the 21st century. India successfully integrates ancient traditions with cutting-edge technology, rural agricultural communities with global technology centers, and dozens of distinct cultural traditions within a unified democratic framework. The country that gave the world concepts like zero in mathematics and ahimsa in philosophy now contributes artificial intelligence algorithms and renewable energy innovations to global development. Yet challenges remain immense, providing quality education, healthcare, and economic opportunities for 1.4 billion people, while protecting the environment and maintaining social cohesion represents one of humanity's greatest ongoing experiments. The success or failure of this experiment will profoundly influence not just India's future, but the prospects for sustainable development and peaceful coexistence in an increasingly interconnected world. India's story reminds us that geography is not destiny, but it provides the stage upon which human ambition and ingenuity perform. From the snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas to the tropical beaches of the south, from the fertile plains of the Ganges to the volcanic plateau of the Deccan, India's extraordinary geographic diversity has nurtured human civilization for over 5,000 years. Today, as India stands poised to become a developed nation by its centennial of independence in 2047, it carries forward the accumulated wisdom of millennia while embracing the possibilities of an uncertain but promising future.